Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Thursday, January the 11th. And today we're going to talk about the border and the situation developing at the border, which is, of course, getting more and more complicated because now we have a new player in the debate, not just Governor Abbott and the President of the United States, but now we have the President of Mexico expressing what he wants. And it's extremely interesting. So let's say hello to our friend Allan Wall joining us once again. Allan, welcome. How is the weather up there?
It's mostly cold, then it gets warmer, but I hear in a few days we're really going to get hit hard, it sounds like.
Yes. And here in North Texas, we're going to get a real storm. But I do plan to watch the Cowboys game, which is why I'm wearing my Cowboys jacket.
Yeah.
In a very partisan display of support here for the Cowboys. So
Okay,
I hope
great.
they win. But it's going to, these playoff games are always, you never know what's going to happen. A team comes in and they may have a lower record, but they may come in with the right mojo. And you know how it is. You just have surprises.
Right.
And so we'll see. But anyway, Allan, I know we've had you many times on the podcast and now on the video cast, but give us a little update. What are you up to these days? What are you writing?
Well, I'm still writing Border Hawk News, which, by the way, is a very great source for what's happening on the border. It's updated daily. And also VDare. But I'm also working on a new project, a new website that I want to have strictly about Mexico. Just have news from Mexico, translations of articles from Mexico and things that maybe don't get covered in the mainstream media. I feel like we need better coverage of Mexican news in the United States.
Oh, I agree with you. And in fact, that's how we met, if you remember.
Yes.
Through Bernard Thompson.
Right.
His website. And I was trying to remember, I lost the name of the website all of a sudden. What was that website called?
Mexidata Info.
Right, Mexidata Info. And I thought he did a really nice job of doing that, where he would, translate or have things in English.
Yes.
Which would be very easy, of course, to read for Americans up here. I mean, there are many Spanish sources, of course, the Mexican press.
Yes.
But to have something in English, I thought Mr. Thompson did a fabulous job.
Oh, yes.
And
updated once a week. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's how you and I met. Hard to believe Bush was president when you and I met.
Wow.
So we go back a few years, don't we?
Yeah, that's hard to believe. Yeah,
that is hard to believe. I remember our first chat. I think it had to do something with the Merida plan. So we're dating ourselves a little bit.
Yeah,
going back to President Calderon and President George W. Bush. So it's been a while, but I really hope your project works out, because I would be one of the people who would read it and follow you daily, because that is exactly what is missing. What is missing is a source of good English news about Mexico. There are some newspapers, of course, that do that. The New York Times and Reuters does that too. But I think what you're thinking about, hopefully it works out. And I like you to keep up with, or at least let me know what's going on with that project, because I think it's a tremendous idea, Allan.
Okay, I'll let you know. We're working on it right now, and I'd like to get it rolling, and then start gradually getting into it, because I just think we need more people need to understand Mexico more in the United States. A lot of times it's just, there's some good coverage, but it just doesn't cover the whole panorama of what's happening there.
No, you're right. And I know that there's this lady in Mexico, Therese Margolis, who was doing that website, Paul's News Mexico, but something's happened to that website. They're not updating. I hope everything is going okay. But that was a very interesting source of news.
Right.
For me, I would check that every day. Hopefully that website comes back, because they had daily contributors, and they had a lot of interesting information about Mexico in English, which
Yes.
really made it worthwhile. Well, Alan, with respect to the border, uh, I think there's three players here, if I could use that word. You've got President Biden and the federal government, then you have Governor Abbott and the state of Texas, and now a new player in this scene, and that's the president of Mexico, Lopez Obrador, who really got into it. I was not expecting that, but he really put some demands on the table. So let's talk first about President Biden. I cannot believe how the federal government is allowing this to go the way. I mean, nobody has been. I have not seen a logical explanation of what's happening on the border. Even if you want to be more humanitarian, I'm not sure this is the best way to do it. And the idea of bringing people into the country with a little piece of paper to see a judge in 5 years, that just doesn't make any sense to me. That's not how I came to the United States, for sure. So what is going on with the federal government in your opinion, and the border, this complete disregard of anything logical on the border, Alan?
Well, I mean, it started, it started when Biden came into office, and he has, his people like Mayorkas. They say the border is secure, and they're letting in people, and they release them all over the place, and they're finding all these sketchy ways to bring people in, like with parole and phony asylum claims. It's just astounding if you look at it, and I believe that the public, the polls I've seen, it's not popular with the public.
No, not at all. In fact, if you look at, when they do these polls, they break him down by issues.
Yes.
And he's like 30, 40 points down.
Wow.
On just the border. I mean, it's like 70-30.
Right.
That's about the way it breaks down. Now, he also has a huge problem, Alan, with Democrat mayors who didn't realize that being a sanctuary city meant that people were actually going to come.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of, I laugh a little bit because it's hard to believe. I mean, they had no idea what they were getting into. They thought it was a great political slogan. And then all of a sudden there's people showing up and they go, wait a minute, I didn't know this was part of the act, And so
exactly.
it's funny in that sense, but it's killing New York and Chicago to just to say.
And it shows their hypocrisy because, the mayor of New York City, he complains about Texas sending people. Well, what about Texas? Texas is bearing the brunt of it more than any other state. And yet they don't care about that. It's just, the NIMBY, not in my backyard.
And Arizona too.
Yes, yes.
Arizona is taking it very hard too. In fact, their hospitals on the border are pretty much out of business because of they just cannot keep up with providing local residents hospital services.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, it's a chaotic situation. The closest thing to this that I remember, and maybe you remember this, back in April of 1980, you had something called the Mariel boat lift.
Yeah.
But that was, that was a little bit like this too, in the sense that people were just coming. But that was 100,000 people over roughly 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. And, the Carter administration stopped it. And President Reagan, made it very clear to Castro, this will not happen again. Okay. And so Castro never did it again. But that's the closest thing that I can remember like this, where about 100,000 people came in. Now, Cubans like I am, but they came in and 80% of them were fine people. Maybe 90% of them were fine people. I mean, they've settled into the country. And I know some of them personally. A newspaper publisher here in the area was one of them. And I believe several others in Miami, successful business people and entrepreneurs and politicians. But that's the closest thing I can remember to this. I have never seen it on the border like this before, Alan. You study the border more than me. Has anything like this ever happened before?
Not at this level. I mean, we've had surges before, but wow, this is just nonstop for several years. It's just astounding. And if you see where they're from too, they're from all over the world.
And that leads me to another point. I'm glad you mentioned that, because in the past, most of them were Mexicans
Right.
or Central Americans.
Yeah.
But the Mexicans would come over, across the border, work, maybe send money back. But look, it was illegal, we know, but it was not as chaotic as this is.
Right.
I mean, that's the difference. I mean, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s and so on, you had, waves of people, but it wasn't like a caravan. It was generally people coming in individually or maybe coming in a group of 3 or 4, but it was not chaotic. It was illegal, yes, but it was not chaotic like this, Alan.
Right.
Now,
right. Oh yeah, it's just astounding when you see that in the pictures.
yeah, and then when you hear Tony Gonzalez, representative from the border, Republican, and Henry Cuellar, who's Democrat from the border, they say something like 80% of these asylum requests are going to be denied, or something like that. That they're not even going to make it. Most of these people, so we're bringing them in, and we know that 80% are going to be rejected. So what do you do after that, Alan? You're going to deport them?
The question is, would they be deported? I don't think the administration has any plans to, because they believe once they get in here, they will not be deported. And they're probably right.
I don't know how they get deported, because, I mean, the ones that do show up, I guess will get a letter saying you didn't make it. But the 80%, 70% that don't show up, I don't know where you find them. I don't know how they're controlling these people. I don't know if they're leaving a forwarding address. I wouldn't think that's very reliable, though, a forwarding address. I wouldn't, I wouldn't bank on that address being very reliable 5 or 6 years from now. So it's just an absolute mess. Now, Governor Abbott has signed this new law, the SB4. I'm sure you're familiar with that, where they're talking about arresting the people who don't come in through the ports of entry. It's not everybody, just the people who come in. And that is now, the federal government is now suing Texas. What do you think about that?
Well, and the problem is the federal government is not doing its job, so Texas has to step up. So this is bringing a real constitutional conflict. But I think Abbott's right to do something.
I agree. And I was talking to someone from Telemundo the other day. He was asking me about it. And I said, look, I understand it's a radical approach, meaning for a state government to do what Governor Abbott has signed. But, the situation is drastic.
Drastic times.
And that's right. And think of all those ranchers on the border. I mean, you used to write about stuff like that. All the ranchers on the border, the small towns on the border. Yep. I read that the city, the police chief at Eagle Pass, he had spent his whole budget like in the first 90 days.
Yeah.
I mean, unbelievable.
Right. And like that you mentioned Arizona, that town, Lukeville, that's just been, under siege. My son and I went there about 13 months ago, and that is a small place. It's not a big, facility. And we were in Sonora, drove about 120 miles, and we just came into the United States at Lukeville. And wow, I don't know how they can handle all that rush that they're having there now.
No, I agree. And the big problem in Arizona, from what I'm hearing, is that the local services have just been exhausted.
Well, yeah.
You have to understand, too, and I'm sure you know this, that Arizona is a smaller state than Texas. I mean, population, that is. Has a much smaller economy. I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the good people of Arizona, but I think the entire GDP of Arizona is probably maybe the size of Austin, Texas, or the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I mean,
Could
it's
be,
not a
yeah,
big
could
state,
be.
and so they don't have a lot of resources. Now, I was being asked by some of the people here locally, and I want to get your reaction to this, of how the Supreme Court is going to deal with this. And I said, be careful what you wish for, because the argument that Texas is making is a pretty sound argument. Texas is
Yes.
saying, we understand that this is your job, but you're not doing it, so we have to do it. That's basically the argument. And
Right.
I don't know. The Supreme Court may look at that and say, you know what? We see the pictures on TV too. You're right.
Right. Because constitutionally, it's the federal government's job to protect us from invasion. What if they don't? That's why we have a constitution, so the federal government has certain prerogatives, but what if they don't carry those out?
Right.
It's
But there is something I've heard, maybe you're familiar with this, but there is something that Governor Abbott keeps talking about, and that is there's some article in the Constitution, the federal Constitution, that grants states, these kinds of rights to defend themselves. I'm not exactly sure where it is in the Constitution, but the governor keeps talking about that
right.
That there's something in the federal Constitution that says
It's an exception clause for if you're under attack and if you're under invasion. Yeah.
So it's the exception clause in the federal
Yeah.
government or in the federal Constitution. And do you know the history of it at all? I'm just curious.
Well, I guess they just put it in there when it was drafted, and but it was never really an issue till now.
Right.
We haven't really been in this situation.
Right, exactly. But I think it was probably put in there. I'm guessing, but I think it was probably put in there to satisfy some of the states' rights. Back then, when it was being written. I think
because some of the people, some of the states, they thought the Constitution, even though it's limited government, it was too much even for them. So they wanted to have that in there,
right,
for the states.
But that's why they put the Bill of Rights, because they wanted that in there as well. So it's called the exception clause. Okay.
Well, that's what I'm calling it. There may be another term for it, but it is in there. I've seen it in there. A couple of I can't remember exactly the exact reference, but I've written some articles and referred to it. But it's definitely in there.
Yeah, and that's what the governor is basing his whole argument on.
Right.
He's basically saying, look, I got to do this because you're not doing your part. That's kind of what.
That's a good case, I think. Right.
I think it's a good case, and everybody keeps saying, well, it's going to go to the Supreme Court. Yeah, you might regret that it did. It goes. Because this is a very conservative court, but it's also a very constitutional court, I think. And you might have 6 judges, or at least 5, I think 6, who look at this and go, yeah, but what are you going to do if you're Texas and it's costing you money? This is costing a lot of money, Allan, here in Texas. I mean, it's a big expenditure. Well, the other player in the border novela, if I could put it that way, is our good friend President López Obrador of Mexico. As you know, the Biden administration sent a delegation down there, and López Obrador said, well, yeah, I mean, I like to help you, but you gotta, I guess, legalize 10 million people up here. You've got to I guess send $20 billion to Latin American countries, and then you have to drop the embargo against Cuba, and drop the sanctions against Venezuela.
Yeah, wow.
And I would love to have been in that room, because I have a feeling that Blinken and Mayorkas were not expecting that. I'm guessing, but I don't believe they went to Mexico to hear that. I really don't.
No. Huh. Yes, he's very demanding, but it fits in with things he said in the past anyway. Sometimes I read his morning press conferences. Well, it's amazing some of the stuff he'll say. It's just, and he seems to be getting more unhinged as he reached the end of his term,
Yeah, it probably. I mean, I don't follow him every day, but I can tell you that all the people I know in Mexico are scared to death of him. For some reason, they see him as a bit of a of a crazy guy.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I don't know. I mean, there's even fears that he's not going to leave the presidency. I don't think that's going to happen.
You
But
know,
anyway,
when we went to Spain last March, and some people in Spain were talking about him. They did not have a good opinion of him either. They like Mexicans, but
right.
they didn't care much for the AMLO presidency.
Well, he's a character now. He's very charismatic. You know, it's
Oh
funny
yeah.
because when I went to Mexico the last time, which was Christmas 2021, and we were there, and I was talking to an old friend, and he said Lopez Obrador and Trump are the same personalities.
Oh.
That's what he was saying. That they're both
Yeah.
the personalities, maybe not
Right.
the way,
Right.
but their personalities. They love to be the center of attention,
Yeah.
and they want to be the king of the party, or the, you know, whatever the word is. And I don't know, but there are times when he does remind me of Trump
Yeah.
in the sense that he's very outspoken and so
Right.
on. But I mean, the four things that he's demanding, Alan, let's go through them. And let's start with Venezuela sanctions. Uh, first, I'm not even sure the president can do that on his own. Maybe he can release some sanctions, but I think that's a congressional action, as I understand it, Alan.
Yeah. I mean, it's just crazy, for him to say that.
Right,
He's telling us how to run our foreign policy.
right. He's also forgetting to say that the reason Venezuela is such a basket case
Is
is
because of their
because
policy.
of the policies. 20, 30 years ago, this was a very prosperous country,
Right. It's a
and now
shame.
they're all falling apart. So maybe instead of blaming our sanctions, maybe he can say something about Maduro.
Right. Right.
But
And
Alan, that takes me to, forgive me for saying this or interrupting you, but this takes me to my next point. He loves dictators, left wing dictators.
yeah. Yeah. Yep. Fidel and
Yes,
yeah.
the guy from Cuba, Diaz Canel. He got into a fight with Peru because his
Yep.
guy was replaced. So he has a real charm for left wing dictators.
Oh yes, of course.
Now, a lot of my Mexican friends have told me over the years that they do that for public consumption in Mexico, that they want to keep the left in Mexico happy. So they embrace people like Castro and these others just so that the left in Mexico doesn't criticize them. I don't know how valid that is, but that's
I,
what I
that's
had always heard.
I think that's part of it, and I also think it's to show their independence from the United States. They're saying, "Hey, look, we can be buddies with, you know, Cuba and Venezuela."
I think that has a lot to do with it. Yeah, they can say, we're a sovereign country,
Yeah.
we
Right.
can have relations with whoever you want, whether you like it or not. Now, Cuba, the embargo, the problem with Lopez Obrador, obviously, he probably knows, but he's not saying it. The problem is the reason for the embargo was because Cuba had stolen all these American properties,
Oh
or the
yeah.
Cuban government.
Right.
So the way that the embargo is crafted, or the wording is, Cuba would have to compensate these investors. They don't have any money to do that, and on top of that, they would have to have elections and make some.
Oh well. Yeah.
So you can forget that one. I mean,
That's
he doesn't
that's
have the
a
votes, and
non-starter.
yeah, he doesn't have the votes to do that. So I think those two are, as there's an expression in Cuban Spanish, or in Cuban talk. My mother and my father would use it all the time. It's when you speak to the gallinero. Gallinero is where all the chickens are. You know how they all stand up. And sometimes when you're just speaking to the public or in mass, you just say things like this because you're going to get a reaction from the audience, but you can't do anything about it. You just get a reaction. And I think that this is just Lopez Obrador with Cuba and Venezuela. This is Lopez Obrador sort of projecting himself as a third world leader, which is what I
Yeah.
think he wants to do after he leaves office, Alan.
I think you're right. I think you're right. Be like Mandela or Gorbachev or these people that are considered elder statesmen of the left.
Mandela comes to mind because what he's done, what they've done to South Africa is a
Oh,
disaster. I mean, he can't even mention it. Now,
oh yeah,
the other two things that he wants, $20 billion for I guess the countries in the region. First of all, I mean, honestly, $20 billion. I mean, if you're really going to do it, it would take a lot more than $20 billion. I don't know. It
right.
seems to me. It seems he just threw that figure out there. But if you really, I mean, I remember when President Reagan had something called the Caribbean Basin. You may remember that
Yes, yes,
from the
yes.
1980s. But that was not about giving people money. That was about encouraging American companies to invest and
Yeah,
create manufacturing operations in these
that's better.
countries.
That's better.
And that's probably a better idea, but that takes time. It's not something you do right away. Well, tell me, what do you think of the 10 million that he wants to legalize?
Well, it's. I mean, it's kind of typical that Mexican government always is trying to get the United States to have an amnesty, and it's just pretty typical, you know. But once again, he's meddling in our, sovereign immigration policy. But that never stopped him before.
Right, but why don't I mean, just out of curiosity, this is just obviously your opinion. Why didn't he do that with Trump when Trump went to see him? Uh,
Well,
I
it's
mean, what
amazing.
did Trump say to him that his reaction was totally different? Trump went to
He,
see him, and his reaction was, "Okay, let's stay in Mexico." So
it's
Trump must have told him some consequences that Blinken and Mayorkas didn't tell him, Alan.
it's astounding to see the difference the way he treated Trump. Actually, I was following it. He never, as president, as far as I could find, he was very complimentary of Trump. He got along very well with Trump, and he did what Trump said when Trump he threatened Mexico with the tariffs, and so they immediately fell into line, and they actually were able to reduce the flow of people, non-Mexicans passing through Mexico and to remain in Mexico. It's just astounding. But now under Biden, I think it's because American leadership makes a great difference, but it depends on what kind of American leadership.
Right. And, getting back to that Merida plan that President Bush and Calderon negotiated, I think that was, again, Calderon understood that Bush was serious
Yeah,
and that, he wanted to help Mexico, but he was serious about the problem. Now, there's also, and I don't know how true this is, but I understand that people say, I should emphasize that people say that President Trump had also warned him about a couple of other things, putting a tax on remittances and naming these cartels as terrorist groups.
oh yeah.
It's creating more options for the president. Do you believe that? That again, I was neither one of us was there at those meetings, but do you believe that that's the way Trump approached it, saying, "Hey, look, I got options and I can play them. So
Yeah, I don't.
play with me, and we can fix this. But play against me, and I can play against you." Do you
I
think that's probably what happened?
Probably one way or another. I wouldn't dare to say how he did it, but somehow he did it, or
Yeah,
he
because
gave that
he
impression.
he got Remain in Mexico in play, which I think turned out to be an excellent program.
Yeah,
And it's funny when I talk to Mexicans, they're angry that their country has been turned into like a highway to come to the United States. They
yeah.
don't like that either.
Oh, and you have those guys. They riot and they cause trouble. It's just amazing. Yeah,
And then there's also another unintended consequence of the border policy. Look what's happening in Ecuador,
oh, that's
where
terrible. Yeah,
where you basically have these gangs on the
yeah,
streets, and the country is in almost a state of it is emergency, I guess, a state
yeah,
of emergency. And so to me that's related to the border crisis, because I think the border crisis and has I'm not saying this was the intention, but the cartels have clearly benefited from it.
oh yes,
Yeah, I
right.
agree.
And it's a
Yeah.
hemispheric. It's the whole hemisphere. It's not just U.S. Mexico border, but it has effects all up and down the hemisphere.
Oh, absolutely, because you have, Ecuador elected a right center president who I think is a very good man, who could be like the one in El Salvador who's cleaned up that country. I mean, that
Yeah,
country is
that's pretty astounding.
outstanding how he's cleaned up the country. And that should be the model, frankly, that we should be supporting in the United States instead of, flirting with these left-wing dictators. Let's support the right center Democrats because they're Democrats. I mean, these people are elected,
Right.
and we should be supporting that. Well, Allan, I know we've gone through a lot of things and our time is almost up, but anything else that we missed that you wanted to say about the situation? I think I've gone through all my notes, but I'm sure there's always something that I left out.
Well, I'm sure it's going to be an interesting year because you've got all this stuff on the border. You got the Mexican election, the U.S. election. Who knows what, in a year, who knows what we're going to be talking about? It's just, it's going to be an interesting year one way or another, I think.
I agree with you there. I'm not sure who knows what we're going to be talking about in 30 days because things are so fluid. Things are so fluid. And we have not heard, speaking of the Mexican election, I have not heard of any violence. I don't know if you have.
No, I haven't.
In the Mexico election, but I expect some.
Yeah.
I expect some because I do think that, let me just say this and tell me if you think this is true. I saw on a Mexican website a study that said that 81% of the Mexican territory was under the control.
Cartels.
They don't call it cartels, but criminal elements. Do you think that's true?
I've seen stuff like that too. I think, yeah, probably. I guess because it's sort of like it exists in two different levels. On the one level, you have the legitimate government and everything, and then you have the cartels. And so
I had a Mexican friend say to me when I told him that about the 81%, he says, that sounds exaggerated. And I said, okay, well, what figure do you think it is?
Yeah, what would he say?
And he really didn't know what figure. He said it was maybe too much. But I think what we have to understand is that when we say 81%, or at least when this article said 81%, that's a lot of open space.
Yeah.
It's not population centers.
Right.
In other words, I still think the government controls the cities and the population centers. It's when you get out of that.
Yeah.
When you start driving through the interior and you get into these small towns, that may be where the criminal elements have more influence. That's my guess. From all of this. Well, Allan, my gosh, every time we talk, the time flies, but it's a great pleasure to chat with you. I hope that you are ready for what appears to be a winter weekend. We're going to have a lot of, well, here in the area, they're talking about some precipitation Sunday night and into Monday. Good news is that Monday's a holiday for most people, so they're not going to have to go to work. But on Tuesday, what they're projecting here is temperatures like under 10 degrees.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, you feel like you're in Chicago. I mean, those kinds of temperatures. So I assume it'll be not much different for you guys up there.
Right. So we got to stock up in case we get stuck in the house a while. On the farm, you got to break the ice for the livestock, so they can.
Right. Yeah. Some of those things that we take for granted in the cities.
Yeah.
We assume that we just go to 7-Eleven and buy milk.
Right.
We think it's that easy. But I can tell you that it's going to be cold. And I just, I wish you and your family. I know that here, what makes everything freaky in the Dallas area or North Texas is the ice.
Yes.
I can handle the temperature.
Right.
You can just dress up.
Right.
But when you get ice on the roads, this part of the world just goes into a state of panic. and the best thing to do is just to stay home.
Right.
Because the
Now, I always
streets,
hear that, you know, if you go farther north, they're better prepared for it and they can handle more of it.
well, I
But
know that from personal experience because I lived in Wisconsin and I lived
right,
in
that's right.
Maryland.
You know about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can tell you that that's exactly true. When you're up in Wisconsin, well, first of all, people are more accustomed to it.
Yes, of
So,
course.
I mean, they don't
Right.
freak out when they get a snowstorm
Right.
because they have them all winter. But you're right, they are usually quicker and better prepared. I think they have more equipment actually too.
That too. You're right. Right.
And so I think they're better prepared for it. I think people know how to drive in the snow better. So yeah, I think that's
What
probably
I've
true.
heard.
Up
Yeah.
north, they're better, but we're not in Texas, even though despite all the best of intentions, they were showing. So in the newscast today, they were showing these trucks getting ready to go out. So we do a great job of preparing, but the ice always beats us.
Yeah.
The ice
Yeah.
has more willpower than we do, I guess. So I say I don't care how cold it gets as long as we don't get ice. That's
That's
my when I pray to God, that's what I say. God, I don't care how cold you make it, just don't give us any ice.
that's the difficulty right there.
That's
Yes.
the difficulty. Well, Allan, have a great weekend, and I hope the Cowboys win.
Okay. Go Cowboys. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Our good friend, Allan Wall. Allan has his own website, as well as we heard during the conversation that he's planning to do a website about Mexico. I'm really looking forward to that. I hope that's a good project for him because we need a good English-speaking website to talk about what's happening in Mexico, and a lot of stuff happening on the borders. So it's going to be a tense issue here, I think, for quite some time. Thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.